Sochi pravahas napitatma vrinde bandhu kabandhu duti divya vaso vrinde namaste charanara vrinda.
Hare Krishna, Nama Om Vishnu Padaya, Krishna Prasaya Bhutale, Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Saminti Namine, Namaste Saraswati Deva Gauravani Pracharine, Nirvashesha Shinvadi, Vashkatya Deshadanine, Panchakalpatrubhascha Kripasindu Bevacha, Patitana Pavanabhyo, Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to our presentation tonight on helping children cope with grief by Mahavisnupriya Devi Dasi. And I'm Dhira Devi Dasi. Grief in children is often a neglected topic because they don't show it the same way as adults do. However, children do grieve. Their grief can come from death of a loved one, suicide, divorce, or separation, and so on. Mahavisnupriya Devi Dasi is going to help us understand the topic better and give us tips on resources and how to help such children. In the description of this presentation, there are links to several handouts that Mahavisnupriya Devi thought were important for you to have. Her contact email is also listed there. For those who may not know Mahavisnupriya Devi, let me tell you a little bit about her amazing career. She was born and raised in Honolulu. She graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Education in Early Childhood Education and Child Psychology, and was awarded a Master's in Social Work after completing a project that later became the national model for Healthy Start program. Mahavisnupriya Devi has over 23 years of experience working with abuse and trauma. Some of the programs she worked on include PATCH, that's Parents Attentive to Children. She developed a child abuse prevention program for the Navy and a sexual assault intervention program for military recruits. She set up a nonprofit 501c3 organization to make sure daycares were set up to standard in Hawaii and provided new parents with training on how to care for their children. In the Navy, she became the head of the Victim Services Division of Fleet and Family Services Center, dealing with those experiencing trauma and victimology. She also trained personnel in the dynamics of child abuse at one of Hawaii's school districts. In the middle of all that, Mahavisnupriya Devi became initiated by Srila Prabhupada in 1975 and soon married her husband, Gosthabihari Das. She worked for ISKCON'S Child Protection Office from 1996 to 2010 with Dhira Govinda Das and Tamohara Das. Currently, Mahavisnupriya Devi Dasi counsels devotees as needed. And as I said earlier, her contact information is in the description of this presentation. Wow, that's quite an amazing resume. Please help us understand grief in children, Mahavisnupriya Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Harival, I'm happy to be here. Let's see. As many of you know, in our community recently, we had two deaths. One where two young children lost their young mother, and another Srila Prabhupada disciple passed away, leaving his adult children and grandchildren bereft. So I want to begin this talk on helping children through grief by talking about three essential topics that we all need to understand more clearly. I want to begin with trauma first, which may be confusing to some people, then cover grief and mourning, and lastly, hitting on a topic known as traumatic grief. In each of these sections, I will be citing adult reactions as well as children's reactions, so you can see fine points of difference between those that affect adults and how children are affected. I also try to reinforce important points by restating them a few times over, then ending by giving pointers to parents, grandparents, teachers, or any others who may have to help children deal with grief. So we'll begin with, what does trauma in children look like? The difference between reactions to our everyday stressors and a child's traumatic stress is that reactions to trauma interfere with daily life. They impact our ability to function normally, and they affect our interaction with others. The effects of trauma manifest differently from child to child, and they vary based on age and developmental level. However, a general sign that your child is suffering from traumatic stress is that they may act in a way that is very uncharacteristic for them. Big changes in their behavior is a strong indicator of trauma. Sometimes signs may not manifest at all, or they may develop very gradually. As a parent, you may not be aware of how serious the reasons are behind your child's reactive behavior. Asking them about what they might be feeling in the moment when you see this different behavior is letting them know that you are concerned and you want to be supportive. Traumatic stress manifests differently in different individuals, as they do in children also. One example from my own experience was when I was working with the military doing counseling therapy. Two ladies made appointments with me within the same week. Both had been recently in a local bank when it was being robbed. One lady was 43 years of age, very active in her military community and with her children and with her church. The other lady was 22 years old, moved on to our military base within the last year with her husband. They had no children. She was new to military life, had not made any friends since moving to our town, and told me that she did not go to church, nor had any religious training in her upbringing. Both women had been held hostage in the bank for close to 5 hours. Both were made to lie down on the floor at gunpoint. They had their purses, wallets, cell phones, and anything of value taken away from them, so they could not contact anyone or alert anyone that they were in a very dangerous situation. The bank manager came to work that day 2 hours late because he had a previous meeting in another location that morning. Yet every bank employee knew of his absence in advance. When he approached the back door of the bank, it was locked, which was usually open for employee use only. This caused him immediate apprehension. So the bank manager went next door to another business and was able to look into the bank windows without being seen. He saw men in masks, carrying rifles, and he immediately called the police. The people in the bank were tied up, their mouths taped with duct tape, and were moved from one location to another, hour after hour, finally ending up on a cold basement floor where the departing robbers turned off all the lights, leaving them in total darkness. As you can imagine, it must have been extremely terrifying for 26 people, employees and customers. I'm imagining if I were in that situation, I might be thinking, how is this day going to end? Is this the end of my life? Am I ever going to see my family again? So they're tied up, they can't move, and they're thinking these thoughts that are very, sensory traumatic thoughts. But long story short, the 43-year-old woman worked with me for about 6 months of weekly visits and within that time had gotten the trauma largely out of her system. No nightmares, no intrusive or irrational thoughts, no flashbacks, no fears of something like this happening again. As she would tell me, her strong faith in God had gotten her through all of it. The 22-year-old woman had a completely different experience. After 12 months of therapy, she still could not drive past the bank. She would drive blocks out of her way just to avoid seeing that bank and any memory it may trigger. When she and her husband were transferred to their next duty station, I had to send all my case notes and all my testing documentation and all the paperwork that she had filled out with us ahead to my counterpart at the new base to continue the work that we had begun together. What was the difference? Why was one woman able to heal much faster and the other had to have lots more therapy? It's what nurses, social workers, teachers, and psychologists know as protective factors, defined as conditions or attributes in individuals, in families, in communities to promote the health and the well-being of children and families. This young woman had not developed enough protective factors to assist her mental well-being. Her family was poor. Her father lost job after job due to his heavy drinking. When her father was at home, he was often abusive and punitive. She told me that often there was no food in the house growing up, and her mother had to take jobs cleaning bars, restaurants, or gas station bathrooms. She didn't care for school because she felt she didn't fit in. She didn't have nice clothes like the other girls, and some kids called her names. She left school at 15 years old and went to work in a bakery as a clerk/helper. So she didn't grow up with positive attitudes, values, or beliefs. She never learned any conflict resolution skills. She didn't have good mental, physical, spiritual, or emotional health. She had very low self-esteem and no positive self-esteem. Success at school or socialization was dismal. She hadn't received any good parenting, so she had acquired no skills to take better care of herself. She was deathly afraid of having children and deeply afraid that she could not be a loving mother. And that statement that she could not be a loving mother immediately tells me that she didn't have a loving mother, so she had no one to model what a loving mother is for her. She did not have any positive supervision or interaction with teachers, relatives, or at home. And there was no strong social support in her life until she married her military husband. So trauma occurs when a child feels intensely threatened, scared, or shaken up by an event that happens to the child or to the loved one of a child. They're experiencing feelings of being under great pressure and with a loss of control. Whether it's an emotional trauma or a psychological trauma or a physical trauma like physical abuse, the event creates stress and it erodes the child's sense of stability. These traumatic experiences can provide physical, psychological, and emotional reactions that can last a lifetime. It is important to note that each child interprets his or her experiences in unique ways. An experience that is extremely traumatic for one child may not be so for another child, as I've just outlined in the example of the two female clients during the bank robbery. Also, not all scary, dangerous, or overwhelming events are considered traumatic for some children because of the protective factors that I just mentioned. We all experience reactions to feelings of stress, but the difference between reactions to our everyday stressors and a child's traumatic stress is that reactions to trauma interfere with daily life, they impact the ability to function, and they affect our interactions with others. Often these symptoms appear when the child is somehow reminded of the stressful experience. So children may exhibit signs of traumatic stress if they endure experiences like physical, sexual, verbal, or emotional abuse, abandonment or neglect, domestic violence, violence in the children's community. And our country is now seeing more and more school shootings where children are being killed. Loss of a loved one is very stressful. A young child, even a change in caregivers could be traumatic. Serious accidents, mental diagnoses, events, and life-threatening illnesses. Natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, or tsunamis. Exposure to substance abuse, military-related incidents of stress, like the deployment of a parent. For a military child, if one of their parents is military, if they're in the Army, they could be deployed for a year to 18 months. And if they're in Navy on a ship, they can be deployed from 6 months to a year. And I worked for the submarine community, and their deployments were just 3 months. But it's very hard for a child even to be away from their family for 3 months. Of course, I always think that how could anyone be in a submarine, 1,000 feet under the water and enclosed in this capsule, and there's no fresh air and there's no sunshine. It's very traumatic for me anyway. An absentee parent is interesting because that's when a parent is in the home and does not recognize the child, or does not bond with the child, or does not relate to this child. No kind words, no empathy, no compassion, but just ordering them around and then pretending they're not really there. If they need something, they're not there, they're absent. So that's an absentee parent. The other thing is bullying, which is a big issue for young people. And major life changes, like if their family's going through a divorce, if they are moving, or starting at a new school can be stressful for children. So signs that your child may be dealing with trauma. Children often struggle to make sense of a traumatic past, while adults have a more sophisticated capacity to understand what happened, why it occurred, and how to deal with it. Children may not have those skills, and they may get stuck. So how do you know if your child is struggling with traumatic stress? So the effects of trauma manifest differently from child to child and from based on age and developmental level. A general sign that your child is suffering from traumatic stress is that they may act in a way that is very uncharacteristic for your child. Only you know your child best. You may sense that they are not acting in a typical or a normal manner. When would you expect to see changes in your child's behavior? The onset of reactions varies greatly from child to child. Some children start exhibiting signs of stress, traumatic stress immediately after the impactful event. For others, the signs are noticeable weeks or even months later. Your child's behavioral changes may last for days, weeks, months, or even years. But what is important to remember is that these reactions are normal and expected after a child survives a traumatic experience. And you are here to help get them through it. Children of all ages, even infants, are susceptible to the effects of trauma. In fact, developmental trauma refers to traumatic stressors that occur in a child's first 3 years of life. And what a child experiences during this early age tends to resurface as new behaviors in their adolescence and can even continue to manifest into adulthood. While the infant does not understand what is happening to him within the first 3 years, his feelings and his emotions are recording it. They are imprinting it on his brain. These will play out later in his life at various developmental stages. They often begin to appear as a faint memory or something not being right, or a distinct feeling that there's something very wrong with them, often accompanied by a lack of motivation and a general overall feeling of tiredness, disinterest, or the feeling of an illness coming on. Trauma can include a variety of responses and behavioral changes, such as intense and ongoing emotional upset, feelings of fear, terror, or being under pressure, anxiety, or being in a state of constant alert, which is known as hyperalert, nightmares or trouble sleeping, changes in eating habits or loss of appetite, trouble forming attachments or relationships, difficulty trusting yourself or others, engaging in sexual activity, promiscuity in early teen years, difficulty concentrating or paying attention, regression or loss of skills that a child had previously mastered, low academic performance, aches and pains, pounding heart or anxiety, vomiting or upset stomach frequently, incontinence, loss of bladder or bowel control, engaging in substance use or abuse, drugs or alcohol, using them to numb their feelings, engaging in risky behavior. And then there's a handout that is attached to this program, which gives common responses for very young, like preschool children or young elementary school children, and then for adolescents, middle school and high school, that you will have that. Healing your child with some helpful techniques. The basis of healing trauma lies in the belief that a stable, safe, and loving home is the foundation of a healthy upbringing. Children who grow up in a supportive family and community have a greater chance to realize their full potential, lead an independent adult life, and overcome the traumatic experiences of their childhood. The first step in healing a traumatized child is to establish a trusting relationship with them. Children require stable care from a parent or a caregiver in a nurturing environment in order to recover from hardships. Traumatic stress can destabilize your child's sense of security, so it's crucial for you to make them feel safe. For trauma healing interventions to work, you must establish a healthy connection with your child based on unconditional love. In your parental role, you should remain consistent and predictable so that your child can trust in your stability, for instance, by establishing certain routines. This bond is the emotional foundation between children and reliable, dependable adults. And these comforting relationships can actually reverse the effects of adverse childhood experiences. When the atmosphere is supportive, children are extremely resilient. So trauma, again, is always about deep fear, while grief is about loss. After losing a loved one, a child may go from crying 1 minute to playing the next. These changeable moods do not mean that the child isn't sad or that he has finished grieving, because children cope differently than adults. Playing can be a defense mechanism to prevent a child from becoming overwhelmed by emotions. It is normal to feel depressed, guilty, anxious, or angry at the person who has died or at someone else entirely. Very young children may regress and start wetting the bed again or slip back into baby talk, becoming more needy than usual. Grief is the acute pain that accompanies loss. Because it is a reflection of what we love, it can feel all-encompassing. Grief is not limited to the loss of people, but when it follows the loss of a loved one, it may be compounded by feelings of guilt and confusion, especially if the relationship was a difficult one. So we want to encourage a child grieving to express their feelings. It's good for kids to express whatever emotions they are feeling. But since many children aren't able to express those emotions through words, other helpful outlets include drawing pictures, building a scrapbook, looking at photo albums, reading stories, or telling stories. At the Navy's Fleet and Family Service Center where I worked, we had a playroom for working with children under age 12. One of my first experiences working with children in grief was with two brothers. One is 5 years old and the other is 2.5 years old. After a heated argument between their parents, both children witnessed their military dad aim a pistol at their mother, shooting her twice and killing her instantly. At the scene of the crime, the next door neighbor who heard the shouts and the yelling also heard the gunshots, and she called the military police. This neighbor stated that there was often loud arguments in that home in front of the children or late at night when the children were supposedly sleeping. I was notified by NCIS, who were then at the house investigating the crime scene. Since the kitchen was the crime scene, the helpful neighbor ran next door to calm the children until the military police arrived. When a crime occurs on a military base involving the family or a woman or children, my office is always contacted. My duty shift was during the day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. However, I physically worked 7 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. But my job also included training volunteers to become first responders to crisis situations and take calls for help after hours. In the military system, a member is rated, graded, and promoted, not only based on his work at his duty station, but also on his volunteer community service and his leadership qualities. So when NCIS contacted me at 11 o'clock at night, I contacted the first responder on the duty roster who immediately went to the scene. She brought warm blankets for the children, and she asked the neighbors if the boys could stay at her house and away from the chaos of the crime scene. The neighbor agreed, and she and my advocate carried the children next door to her home. The neighbor heated warm milk for the boys, and the two women wrapped them in warm blankets, held and rocked them in a rocking chair until they stopped shaking and trembling, eventually falling off to sleep. The neighbor also agreed to keep the children until their maternal grandparents could arrive. My advocate filled me in regularly and wrote a report of the incident and her actions while at the crime scene. Fortunately, the boys were familiar with the neighbor and her house, as they often played there. I explained to the neighbor a course of action and a treatment plan that included her bringing them to my office on the following morning at a prearranged time. I told her I would be contacting their next of kin regarding the children's placement and update her on how long she would be expected to care for them. Her teenage daughter often babysat for the boys, and she would also be available to help her mother caring for them. The next day, the neighbor dutifully brought the boys to our playroom, and as they acquainted themselves with the room, they started to gravitate to places and things that attracted them. The 5-year-old went straight to the sandbox and began playing with cars and dump trucks, filling them up with sand. I looked over at the 2.5-year-old who was seated at a small children's table where a large box of hundreds of crayons were placed at the center of the table with a pad of paper, blank paper. Out of all the colors, the 2.5-year-old chose the bright red one and was scribbling circles on a page and filling them in with bright red color all over the page. Lots and lots of red and only red scribbled circles. I instinctively knew that he had imprinted the scene of his mother lying on the kitchen floor in her own pool of bright red blood. He was showing me what was clearly on his mind at 2.5 years old. For the 5-year-old, playing in the sand was a distraction that took his mind off of what he witnessed the night before. It is nice to let children play if they are able to, as their emotions may be too overwhelming for them initially. And play is a nice deviation, bringing a sense of normalcy back to them. So I want to talk a little bit about treatment for grieving and traumatized children. One of the best parts of working for the military, beyond the cohesiveness and the organizational structure, was the training that they afforded their employees. I and members of my staff got to travel to many conferences and seminars where leading experts in their fields gave talks and trainings. This is where I met Dr. Bessel Vanderkult, who has done groundbreaking work in trauma and grief, beginning back with service members returning from the Vietnam War. His background is in psychiatry and neuroscience, or how the brain and the nerves function together. One thing that has stuck with me all these years was that he said he could always identify a child that has been traumatized during those crucial years of 0 to 3, just by their bodily movements. So let's suppose if a teacher asks the question of the class, who wants to play dodgeball at recess today? You'll see many hands fly straight up in the air after the question. The traumatized child will shoot his arm off to the side or moving it strangely in some other fashion that is not in sync with the normal reaction of the other children. Bodily movement is a key indicator of trauma or traumatic grief. Dr. Vanderkult explains it as when a child is traumatized in those first years, those early years are so important, 0 to 3, the brain gets stuck until the child learns a way to get it unstuck. He found that movement and play therapy help put the child back in balance. Playing with a beach ball is especially good, as the throwing of the ball, then catching it from the other person allows the child to begin learning to move side to side, anticipating where the ball is going to be next, which increases his brain function to move as well. Beach balls and trampolines are excellent tools for putting a child's brain back in balance. When Vanderkult was working with PTSD veterans at the VA Medical Center, another group of doctors were developing a treatment called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization. It's a hard word to say. Desensitization and reprocessing technique. He observed how they would have their client talk about their trauma, re-experiencing it as fully as they can in a nurturing and safe environment, while the doctor holds his finger close to their eyes and moves it slowly back and forth. They are told to follow the finger with their eyes while talking about their trauma. The EMDR therapy actually was found to be very effective in reducing traumatic symptoms. And over some time, their traumatic memories were completely gone. Vanderkult realized it also was a way for the brain to move stuck memories and emotions to another part of the brain where it could be dealt with and removed more easily. This was also in sync with his own beliefs about bodily movement affecting brain chemistry. Early on in his practice at Boston University Hospital, a patient was referred to Vanderkult, a little girl who had been adopted at age 1. She was growing up in a caring family for 3 years, hearing their speech daily, understanding their mannerisms and behavior, but she never spoke. He recognized her muteness as having to do with brain trauma. In one part of the hospital, there was a gym for working with injured or disabled patients. He took the little girl there, thinking this would be a good place to observe her movements. There was a low to the ground trampoline there, and she immediately went to the trampoline and began jumping. And she loved the experience of jumping, and her eyes lit up. After a few visits of trampoline jumping, she was enthusiastically speaking and expressing her feelings of happiness and joy in her own words. These are some amazing achievements of scientists and medical doctors who in the late 1960s had the courage to think outside the box so that today we can better understand the brain and the body interconnections. I also received a lot of training at the FBI Training Center in the Behavioral Sciences Division, which is a motherlode of statistical information regarding human and criminal behavior. So I want to emphasize again that trauma is deep and it's difficult to overcome, while grief is all about loss, loss of a job, loss of a loved one, loss of a promotion. Learning of a life-threatening illness is also a loss. Children losing their pets or having to move and lose their friends. But trauma accompanied by loss, such as losing a loved one suddenly in a car accident, is called traumatic grief, where trauma and grief come together in the same event. Trauma is about our feelings about what has happened, how we make sense of it, and grief is similar in that it is the internal feelings, thoughts, and remembrances of the loss. So, death, loss, and grief are natural parts of life, but when death arrives suddenly and unexpectedly, such as with suicide or a car accident, the overlap of the traumatic experience and the grief of the loss is overwhelming. Traumatic grief is a sense-losing event, a free fall into a chasm of despair, experiencing all these issues that are part of grief: shock, disbelief, bewilderment, deep sadness, sorrow, confusion. In some cases, people get stuck in their grief and they can't seem to find a way forward. And in certain instances, such as when someone loses a child, or when a child loses a parent, individuals may not want to get out of this state because for them, it means leaving their loved one behind and moving away without them. Because of the trauma embedded with grief, it can be challenging to differentiate between post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and grief or traumatic grief. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a perfect name because post is after trauma, the stress disorder. It makes so much sense. PTSD is about fear and grief is about loss. Traumatic grief will have both, and it includes a sense of powerlessness as well. A person who is experiencing traumatic grief becomes a victim of the trauma in addition to the loss. They will assume those qualities of experiencing trauma even while they're grieving the loss. People who have traumatic grief tend to talk about experiencing physical pains, having trouble sleeping, and are anxious, always on edge. So some of the symptoms can be confused with other mental health issues. For example, a person going through traumatic grief may have a loss of appetite and trouble sleeping, which can resemble signs of depression, or have great difficulty focusing, which can look like a sign of attention deficit disorder. In addition, other signs of traumatic grief include experiencing pain in the same area as the deceased. Now, I knew this about pregnant women, but I didn't know this about trauma. When a man's wife is pregnant and she's going through the trimester and experiencing all these new changes in her body and lots of pains and aches, and sometimes the husband, he feels sympathy pains for his wife. So it's that same kind of connection, emotional connection. They can also have upsetting memories, feeling that life is empty, longing for the person who has died. And this is hearing the voice of the person who died or seeing the person, being drawn to places and things associated with the departed person, experiencing disbelief or anger about the death, thinking it is unfair to live when this person died, feeling stunned or dazed, being envious of others not experiencing traumatic grief, feeling lonely most of the time, and having difficulty caring about or trusting others. Phew. So we're going to move right on to difference between grief and mourning. Grief and mourning are closely related to each other, and they go hand in hand following the loss or a death of a loved one. The difference between grief and mourning are the internal and the external nature of the process. Grief relates to the thoughts and feelings that accompany a loss, from sadness to anger to longing to be with that person. On the other hand, mourning is how feelings of grief are shown to the public, how we show them to the public. They are acts or behaviors that show the sadness or the hurt that someone is experiencing after losing someone they love. They are the physical acts of going to the funeral, planning a memorial, cultural rituals, or just talking with others about the departed one. Those are external acts. That's mourning. In my large Hawaiian family, everyone is either a musician or a hula dancer or both. So when a relative passes away, everyone gathers together at the family home of the departed, or the churchyard, or the burial site, and sings our family songs, as well as the favorite Hawaiian songs of the person who has died. My cousins dance hula, they play their instruments, and often, if we are at a graveyard, for instance, other people there will start collecting or gathering around us to watch our cultural tradition. They often smile, and some may clap, appreciating our performance. Then later, after a feast together, everyone talks about the things they will miss most about our loved one, or some interesting encounters that they experienced with the departed person. Grief and mourning represent different but complementary parts of the healing process. Both grief and mourning can be intense and painful shortly after the loss, but they can decrease after time as healing and acceptance develops. To repeat, grief is one part of this process, the internal part, feelings, thoughts, emotions, our sorrow, our sadness, and all those things that we keep inside. Mourning is external, our actions and our behavior outwardly. The process of mourning allows people to form long-term memories of a loved one and includes adapting and learning new ways to carry on in life without the person they love. These two components, grief and mourning, work together to move us through the bereavement process. If we try to do one without the other, the recovery process is delayed. Mourning is a healthy part of bereavement. It can help people preserve the memory of loved ones and feel hopeful about living a happy and fulfilling life without them. So now we will move on to talking to children about death. And they say it's important to be developmentally appropriate. It's hard to know how a child will react to death, or even if they can grasp the concept. Don't volunteer too much information, as this may be overwhelming. Instead, try to answer their questions. Very young children often don't realize that death is permanent, and they may think that a dead loved one will come back if they do their chores and they eat their vegetables. And a psychiatrist explained it as, children understand that death is bad and they don't like the separation, but the concept of forever is just not apparent. It's not in their brain capacity. Older school-age children understand the permanence of death, but they may still have many questions. Do your best to answer honestly and clearly. It's okay if you can't answer everything. Being available to your child is what matters more. Be direct. When discussing death, never use euphemisms. Kids are extremely literal, and hearing that a loved one went to sleep can be scary. Besides making your child afraid of bedtime, euphemisms interfere with his opportunity to develop healthy coping skills that he will need in the future. Attending the funeral. Whether or not to attend the funeral is a personal decision that depends entirely on you and your child. Funerals can be helpful for providing closure, but some children simply aren't ready for such an intense experience. Never force a child to attend a funeral. If your child wants to go, make sure that you prepare them for what they will see. Explain that funerals are very sad occasions, and many people will probably be crying. If there will be a casket, you should prepare them for that too. Keep in mind that even the best prepared child might get upset, and his behavior can be unpredictable. Kids will not behave in a way that you might want or expect. If you decide that a funeral is not the best place, there are other ways to say goodbye. Planting a tree, sharing stories, collecting items that belong to the dead person and donating them to Goodwill or the Salvation Army with the grieving child. It provides a nice alternative for saying goodbye. For many children, death of a pet will be their first exposure to death. The bonds that children build with their pets are very strong, and the death of a family pet can be intensely upsetting. Don't minimize its importance or immediately replace the dead pet with a new animal. Instead, give your child time to grieve for his dog or her cat. This is an opportunity to teach your child about death and how to deal with grieving in a healthy and an emotionally supportive way. When my son was 7 years old, he had a hamster, Jake, that he loved. He also had a remote control car. When his younger cousin came to visit, his cousin thought it would be fun to put the hamster in the car so Jake could take a ride. Well, the hamster didn't stay in the car once the car began moving. The hamster jumped out and the car ran over the hamster. The hamster was dead, and both boys were so mortified. They cried so loudly that both my husband and I ran in to see what happened. They both were so grief-stricken and sobbing so many tears that my husband decided we need to have a funeral for the hamster. We found an old child's shoebox, lined it with newspaper and soft cotton, and they laid Jake in the small shoebox. They closed it up, and we carried the mouse to the backyard where everyone helped in digging a hole big enough and deep enough for the shoebox. We sang the Maha Mantra to Jake the hamster. The boys found wildflowers and they threw them in on top of the shoebox. My younger nephew asked if Jake might need something to eat while he's in the box. So we also put cheese in the box before we covered him up with dirt. The boys were morose for a day, but we talked about Jake and we answered their questions about death. The idea of an afterlife can be very helpful to a grieving child because we are familiar with our own spiritual beliefs about the afterlife. This is a good time to share them with the children who are grieving. But even if the child you are helping isn't religious, you can still comfort them with a concept that a person continues to live on in the hearts and minds of all those who love him. You can also build a scrapbook or plant something that represents the person you have lost. And please don't ignore your own grief. Children will often imitate the grieving behavior of their parents. It is important to show your emotions as it reassures children that feeling sad or upset is okay. However, reacting explosively or uncontrollably teaches your child unhealthy ways of dealing with grief. One family who lost their 9-year-old son when he was riding his bike and was hit by a car that came speeding around the corner. The driver did not see the boy on the bike. It was a devastating experience for this family, but mom and dad decided that they would cry or weep whenever they felt the need to. And they instructed their 6-year-old daughter to do the same. But if anyone was feeling sad and tearful, the other 2 people would hug the crying person. The 6-year-old understood that if mommy and daddy cry, she should hug them, and that they will do the same for her if she was crying. They gave their child permission to be sad and to cry for the loss of her brother, and also to grieve in a reasonable and responsive way. Children find great comfort in routines. So if you need some time alone, try to find relatives or friends who can help keep your child's life as normal as possible. Although it is important to grieve over the death of a loved one, it is also important for your child to understand that life does go on. Some specific situations might be the death of a grandparent, is also a common experience for young children. And it might bring up questions such as, will my mommy be next? It's important to tell your child that you will probably live a long time more. After the death of a parent, children will naturally worry about the death of the remaining parent or other caretakers. Reassure a child that he or she is loved and will always be cared for. It is a good idea to rely on family members during this time to help provide additional nurturing and caring. Therapy in the case of a significant death, such as the death of a parent or a sibling, is also an option. Therapy provides another outlet for talking when a child might feel that he can't talk with other family members because they are all grieving as well. Many of us have experiences that are very upsetting. We may be disturbed, we may be unable to sleep, we may not be able to eat, we may be irritable, but we integrate it. We integrate it over time and we recover. So trauma is best understood as a failure of recovery. It's a response to an event, and it's not the event itself. Because grief obeys its own trajectory, there is no timetable for feelings of pain after loss, nor is it possible to avoid suffering altogether. In fact, attempts to suppress or deny grief are just as likely to prolong the process. It's important to understand that it's not the nature of the event itself that makes something traumatic. It's really the subjective experience of the child that defines whether an event is traumatic or not. So that concludes my talk. And I guess we're going to talk about the handouts right now.
Yes, I will share them.
Okay. Oh yeah, there it is. These give us ideas of signs and symptoms we should be aware of in preschool or very young children, and in elementary school children, and in middle school and high school. So you can see across the way how they change developmentally. The next one was, the Canadian Mental Health Association, Understanding the Difference Between Grieving and Mourning. I like this very much because it's very, there's a lot of really good tips and very short little information packets. Things to ask yourself is a nice thing to know. The next handout will be how you can strengthen the parent-child relationship and to help heal your child's trauma. There's a lot of really good points here, but what I want to zero in on is asking for help from therapists and child's doctors is a sign of strength, not a weakness. We are not all-knowing like the Lord Supreme. And then the books on children and grief. These should be available in most libraries. These are newer books. When I first started this, there were different titles, older books. Okay, and then they can download them. Is that correct? From
Yes, the links are all in the description. They can be downloaded and saved on your phone or wherever, or you can print them. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Mahavisnupriya Prabhu? I have one question.
Okay.
What happens when trauma and grief, especially trauma, which may result from death or suicide or some other emotional or psychological, sexual trauma? What happens when that trauma is not resolved in childhood? What do we see in adults as a result of unresolved trauma?
We see people who are unable to, what is the word? Not able to fit in the workplace or at school, if they're in college. That the trauma is always there, and there are different ways in which it comes out in behavior. I like that idea, the EMDR, because all of those PTSD were service members returning from Vietnam who had seen horrific things, and yet that they were able to just by using their finger while they're talking and watching, they're moving their eyes and watching while they're talking about their trauma, really help to move the trauma to another part of the brain where it could be dealt with more easily. And there was a high rate of those who went through it getting over their traumatic memories. And those who are unable to get over it or don't even want to admit to it, those people will carry it out in other ways. There will be probably a lot of alcohol and drugs in their lives because they're trying to numb them, self-medicate. They're unable to make good choices for themselves because it's like this weighty thing on your brain that's blocking all the other good stuff in your brain. So anyway.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. There was a movie out recently, a documentary called The Wisdom of Trauma.
Oh, yes.
By Mate Gabar.
Yeah,
and he points that out, that even very educated persons who come from affluent families, if they don't resolve their trauma, they don't learn the tools of how to deal with it, they can end up on the street as homeless people, addicted to so many substances, and etc. It's very very important to heal that.
It's like they know there's something wrong, but they're not strong enough to face it, or they're afraid to face it.
Right. They don't have the tools to process it, or what to do with it.
That's true. That's true.
Anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask?
Is there any questions anyone watching from the temple website?
Yeah, there are some people watching, and they're just there's no questions. They're appreciating your talk, though. They're appreciating what you're hearing. So
I have a question.
Good. This is Dhira.
Yeah. Have you, Mahavisnupriya, have you had much experience with older children, say adolescents, in grief and loss groups? Or with what would you say about that for helping recovery?
So they experienced grief or loss while they were older?
Well,
we're not talking about something from childhood.
Okay, sorry. In the idea of recovering in the idea of the process of grief and mourning,
yes,
I've seen grief and loss groups be created by persons such as yourself. Have you ever? And so I was thinking, does this apply for the older type children who have experienced trauma and loss? Maybe adolescents. Have you ever seen adolescents get into a grief and loss group? And
I haven't done one, but I know that they are available. I think there was a study about males versus females in that age group, and they were saying that a traumatic loss for men, or for the males in that age group, lots of anger, lots of rage, lots of trying to destroy things or putting their fists through the walls. But for the girls in that age, it was more they taking it in, they can't accept it, and they're trying, to believe this is not real. This is not real. It didn't really happen. And they're trying to talk themselves into a place of getting back to normalcy somehow. So you know about that.
Okay, thank you.
You've worked with people dealing with grief and loss, haven't you?
Yeah, I just, yeah, and I was just thinking back to group work. I'm just talking
Yeah.
about, is group work
Yeah.
applicable here? Because I've seen it really help people. You
Oh,
have that mutual aid effect.
Yes.
You know,
I'm
that
not in this alone.
you lost this person and I lost this person, you know.
Yeah.
I
Those
was just amazed at how many groups there are. If you type into Google and look up specific groups for helping people recover from traumatic events, there's quite a few of those groups. Specifically say for suicide survivors.
Yes.
Suicide survivors of suicide groups.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. I'm sorry. But I think that the group work can be very, very effective. I had to do a lot of groups with women who had been raped in the military. Or we had a group for men who had been raped in the military. But they found this bond that they could make with other people that they had experienced very similar to their experiences. And it does really help them to fully accept, or more fully accept, what we know as karma, but for them it's horrific and can be lifelong lasting if we're not pointing them in the right directions.
For children, do you find is it difficult to get them to go to a group?
For children?
Yeah.
I think the most successful treatments are those that help children with play therapy and with art. Art, it can be very, very profound. Like the little 2.5-year-old boy trying to show me, you know, what was in his mind was that pool of bright red blood that he imprinted in his brain. But those two boys, the grandparents came within a week to pick them up. And the grandparents were young grandparents, fortunately for them. I think the grandmother was like 45 or 46, and the grandfather was turning 50. And they lived on a big farm, and they had lots of animals. And so there was a military base about an hour away from where the boys were living. And the person at the base, who was my counterpart, would keep me, she would go out and visit them, do like home visits, and she would keep me abreast of their treatment. And they found a lot of camaraderie with being outdoors, being on a big farm, helping their grandpa and helping their grandma, collecting the eggs from the chickens, and you know, playing with all the animals that they had there. And the grandparents got them, I think it was either a pony or a mule, I can't remember, but it helped these boys so much to, I was praying for them a lot, that they would have a better life.
So if the trauma, if the grief in children goes into years,
Yes.
is that considered abnormal? If it goes over a year or 2 years like that?
No, I would it depends on how they're coping with it. I mean, they might have somebody in their life that is especially kind and loving to them, and just, you know, that really strong, safe, nurturing environment can do a lot. Children can become very, very resilient from having gone through horrific events. I don't think there's a time limit. You know, they may feel it and then they may block it.
Mhm.
And then,
Yeah.
you know, one day they want to look at it, and the next day it's like, it's frightening to them. So it's hard. It's a back and forth.
On that same question, Mahavisnupriya, would you say that it's pretty much an individual process?
Absolutely.
Because I don't think you can really generalize. I'm just thinking of,
Yeah.
you know, the situations, and some people are, you know, it's pretty much every person has got their own path. And
Yeah.
I think Madhurya Lee is trying to bring out the idea of how are you going to help people if it goes on and on? But it would just be something you have to keep checking, you know, keep your eye on.
Yeah, I think you have to keep trying different things.
Yeah.
Group work. I mean, when you first realize what's happened to you, but it may take a really, really long time to own it. So you admit it to yourself that it's real and that you need to do something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my experience in our community, we've had several deaths of
Yes.
parents in the last many years, and they've had children, like teenage children or almost adult, young adult children, and I think it's hard for them. Most of the children that I was in contact with, they did not want to go to counseling. They did not want to talk to anybody. So they often don't talk to anybody, hardly, or maybe they're talking to a friend, but it's doubtful. So it's very difficult to, what do you recommend for somebody like that? What can we do to help these kinds of kids, teenagers in high school, or maybe just getting ready to go to university, like that?
I believe there's there's a season for everything and there's a time for everyone. And some people are just not ready, and you have to kind of wait until they're become a little more open to even hearing a little. And even that might not work completely, but maybe the more they hear about support groups, different kinds of treatments, options, they might, work up the courage to look into it.
Yeah, like you pointed out, the loving, stable family, unconditional love is so important.
Yes.
Yeah, I also like the point that you made that, and like Dhira also said, that no two situations are the same. It might be the same trauma, but everybody reacts differently. Like you explained, the two different kids that lost their father, their mother. And bullying is another one that I really appreciate that you mentioned that as well, that causes so much distress in kids, to the point of that they would like to commit suicide sometimes.
Yes. I've read of a young boy who was bullied every day at school, and another boy who lived nearby would see this, and he wasn't brave enough to go and stop it, but he kept thinking, I got to do something. I have to do something. This can't go on. I'm watching this child being tormented. And so he asked his mother, should I go talk to his parents? And she said, I don't think that's a good idea. I think you shouldn't say anything. This is that problem. If he talks to his parents, then it's his parents' problem, and you should stay out of it. But one day, he was in his yard and he saw the boy coming down the street, and he had his backpack and he had his head down, and he just very glum, and he was shuffling along, and the boy he just got this urge. Something came over him, and he just jumped out of the yard and ran over to the boy, and he said, can I help you? Can I help you carry your books? I see you. I know you're my neighbor. You live over there. And the kid said, okay. And he said, can I walk home with you? And he goes, sure. And then later the boy came over to his house and was playing with him, and they became really good friends. And he finally told him, he said, the day that you ran across the street and met me was the day I was going to commit suicide. So you never know. You never know your effect on other people, and you never know what's in other people's heads. And you think you might know someone, and yet you don't.
Yeah, and I really liked what you said about asking questions if a child's not behaving normally, to ask questions and be there for them to listen.
Yeah. To call attention to it in that moment. And it may be hard for them to say what provoked it, but if you keep seeing it occurring, the same kind of strange behavior, then you have to say, we're going to have a talk, but we have to do it in such a loving way. We just have to be so gentle with these children and compassionate. Pray for Srila Prabhupada to guide us.
Anything else before we close?
Yeah, have you ever heard of children working with the horse therapy?
Yes, I've heard of that.
I know a couple people that
really effective.
Yeah, they went into it in their master's programs. It's all they want to do, and it's specifically to help, with the grief with children.
Yeah, there's so many avenues into how to do this, because there's so many individuals who are unique.
Yeah, and I think it might address that issue of Madhurya Leela's, and both of you are talking about, how do you get someone to get help that needs help? And as you said, there's a time and a season for it. But if people don't want to talk, there's other things you can do, just have a positive relationship, or horse therapy. I think there's even one in this area, a horse therapy farm in the Alachua area.
Oh, nice.
Yes, I've heard a lot about it. Now that you mentioned it, that it's they've even made a couple of films about it. That it's really helpful to kids.
Yeah. So
good idea. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mahavisnupriya Prabhu, for an enlightening presentation. You gave us a lot of information. There's certainly a lot to learn. Thank you also for the resources you gave us. And for the audience, they're available in the description. You can download them anytime you like. It's been a pleasure to have you. I would like to thank all of you taking your valuable time on a weeknight to listen in. Thank you to the End of Life Care team, to Mukya Devi for her continued support, to Vaishnava Dasi for her technical support, and Jai, all glories to Srila Prabhupada. Happy holidays.
Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Ram Ram, Hare Hare.